He outlawed names, erased books, and declared that only his reflection mattered. In Equatorial Guinea, Francisco Macías Nguema turned his deepest fears into laws, making the word intellectual a crime, and rewriting every citizen's identity in his own image. How does a man's fragile mind unravel so far that he sees other people's existence as a threat to his own? The answer begins in childhood trauma and ends with the erasure of reality itself. Francisco Macías Nguema was born in 1924, and his childhood unfolded in the shadow of violence and loss. Raised in the remote village of Mongomo, he entered a world already marked by the iron grip of Spanish colonial rule. His father, a respected Fang chief, was publicly executed by colonial authorities, a warning meant to break spirits as well as bodies. For the young Macías, it was the collapse of the one person meant to protect him, replaced by the cold machinery of foreign power. His mother suffered a fate no less brutal. Accused of witchcraft by local rivals, she was killed in a way that left no room for comfort or closure. The precise details have blurred with time, but the message was clear. In that world, even family could be torn away without warning. These losses were not isolated tragedies. They were part of a landscape where colonial officials decided who lived and who died, and where an accusation could be a death sentence. Survivor accounts describe a climate of suspicion and humiliation. Children like Macías learned to navigate a world where adults disappeared overnight, where the very act of having a name or a lineage could make someone a target. The loss of both parents before adolescence left him with no anchor. With his father gone, the family's standing evaporated. With his mother gone, any sense of safety was shattered. Neighbors and relatives, wary of attracting attention, kept their distance. The boy, who would one day demand absolute loyalty, learned early that trust could be fatal. Colonial brutality did not stay distant. It intruded into homes, villages, and family rituals. The trauma of his parents' deaths was compounded by forced labor, public floggings, and the constant presence of Spanish soldiers and administrators. Humiliation became a fact of life. He grew up aware that his own identity, his name, his family, his language, could be erased at the whim of others. In that atmosphere, resentment took root and quieted into something guarded. Teachers and elders later recalled a boy who rarely spoke, whose moods swung from sullen silence to sudden anger. The need to survive required learning to trust no one. Every relationship was colored by the memory of betrayal and loss. As he grew older, the wounds of childhood did not heal. They deepened, feeding a hunger for control and a fear of vulnerability. The seeds of insecurity, planted during those early years, would later bloom into something far more dangerous. The story of Francisco Macías Nguema begins not with power, but with a child watching his world collapse, and learning that in a land ruled by fear, the only safe identity is the one that cannot be taken away. In 1964, Francisco Macías Nguema boarded a flight to Madrid, not as a tourist or a diplomat, but as a man quietly unraveling. At the Rubin Clinic, he told doctors he felt unstable, his own words, not those of his enemies or critics. The records from that visit remain sealed, but the fact of his self-referral lingers in the margins of history. This was not a gesture of public confession. It was a private alarm bell, rung by a man who had already learned to hide his fears from everyone else. As Deputy Prime Minister, he was expected to embody composure, yet he sought help for a mind he could not trust. Those closest to him noticed changes. Colleagues described unpredictable moods and a growing wariness, even among allies. He was quick to suspect hidden motives, slow to forgive imagined slights. Spanish administrators noted his discomfort in meetings, his tendency to interpret disagreement as personal betrayal. The language of the time was clinical: emotional volatility, suspicion, a mind turned inward against itself. The shadow of inferiority hung over these years. Psychologists studying his life point to the classic pattern described by Alfred Adler: a man wounded by early loss and humiliation, compensating not with humility but with the seeds of grandiosity. Where others might have found solidarity in shared struggle, Macías learned to see every rival as a threat, every slight as proof of his own precariousness. His insecurity was not a secret weakness. It was the engine behind his ambition. No diagnosis from the Rubin Clinic survives to explain what he feared most. But the historical record is clear. Macías recognized something was wrong inside himself long before the world did. His visit to Madrid was less about finding a cure than about confirming that his mind was a battleground. The years that followed would see his compensatory drive intensify. Titles became armor. Power became medicine. The man who once sought treatment for instability would soon demand that an entire nation reflect his image, no matter the cost to truth or to the fragile boundaries of his own identity. This self-awareness did not bring relief. Instead, it hardened into a resolve to control what he could not fix. The sense of inferiority, rooted in childhood, sharpened by trauma, would soon bloom into a need for absolute supremacy. The world would bend or break before he admitted weakness again. In the autumn of 1968, Equatorial Guinea held its first and only free presidential election. Francisco Macías Nguema, once considered a minor figure in colonial administration, appeared on the ballot as a compromise, acceptable to the Spanish authorities but never their first choice. Spanish officials, wary of losing influence, quietly favored candidates they could control. The political landscape was fractured. The Fang majority, Catholic elites, and the Bubi minority each harbored their own fears and ambitions. Macías campaigned on unity and independence, promising to heal wounds left by colonial rule. When the votes were counted, he won a narrow victory over Bonifacio Ondo Edu. Official results gave Macías just over 40% in the first round, then a majority in the runoff. Spanish diplomats, facing the reality of decolonization, endorsed his presidency, hoping he would remain pliable. Within weeks, the new president began to dismantle the fragile checks that had been built into the Constitution. His first decrees targeted the opposition. Political parties, once the sign of a hopeful democracy, were dissolved by executive order. The National Unity Party, the Democratic Party, and the Bubi Union disappeared overnight. Cabinet ministers who questioned these moves were dismissed or threatened. Some fled to Cameroon or Spain. Others simply vanished. The parliament, designed to represent the country's patchwork of regions and ethnicities, became a rubber stamp. Spanish advisors and technical workers, sensing the change in atmosphere, began to withdraw. Those who remained were forced to swear personal loyalty to Macías, not to the Constitution or the nation. The machinery of government was rapidly centralized. Macías issued Decree 415 in May 1971, granting himself absolute authority over all state institutions. Civil servants, judges, and police chiefs were now answerable only to the president. The judiciary lost any pretense of independence. Trials were held in secret, often without records or defense. Local administrators, wary of being labeled disloyal, enforced the new rules with zeal. In the countryside, chiefs and elders who once mediated disputes found themselves sidelined or replaced by party loyalists. The message was unmistakable. There would be no room for dissent, no space for alternate centers of power. The promise of unity curdled into a demand for conformity. Where the colonial system had ruled through division, Macías now ruled through erasure. The institutions that might have checked his authority, political parties, courts, a free press, were stripped away. The tools of democracy became instruments of control. The country's future, once open to negotiation, was now bound to the will of a single man. The machinery of the state, designed to serve the people, had become an extension of his private fears and ambitions. Within months of consolidating power, Macías Nguema began to speak of himself in terms that defied ordinary political language. He declared himself the unique miracle, father of the nation, immortal leader. These titles were not mere ornaments. They were demands. Cabinet ministers, civil servants, even schoolchildren were required to recite them at public ceremonies, their voices rising in unison to affirm the singular greatness of the president. The cult of personality, once a faint echo of colonial authority, now became the engine of state. But words alone could not satisfy his hunger for supremacy. The first true purge began quietly, targeting the country's teachers, priests, and educated professionals. Orders went out to police and party loyalists to remove those who might question, those who might remember a different order. Teachers were accused of spreading foreign ideas. Priests were denounced for loyalty to Rome instead of loyalty to the president. In the capital and in the provinces, lists were drawn up and lives were scheduled. Some were arrested in the middle of lessons, their students left in empty classrooms. Others disappeared after evening prayers, their churches shuttered by dawn. The press, now a mouthpiece for the regime, published bulletins naming the enemies of unity, always the educated, always those with access to knowledge. In the countryside, village elders who had once mediated disputes found themselves replaced by party appointees, often young men with no experience but unshakable loyalty to Macías. The message was unmistakable. Wisdom, learning, and memory were threats to the new order. State radio broadcast the president's titles day and night. He declared that by the will of God, all rights were his. The population was instructed to repeat those words at official gatherings, in markets, even at funerals. To hesitate was to invite suspicion. To object was to risk disappearance. Within a year, the country's schools were nearly empty. Libraries were locked or burned. Survivors recall the sudden silence. No more lessons, no more sermons, only the drone of official slogans. The intellectual class, once small but vital, had been shattered. Some fled to Cameroon or Spain. Others vanished without trace. Those who remained learned to hide their knowledge, to speak in whispers, to erase their own histories. The purge of teachers and clergy did more than eliminate rivals. It stripped the nation of its memory, its conscience, and its hope for renewal. What began as a campaign for unity became a campaign against identity itself. In the place of learning and faith, there was only the president's voice, echoing through empty classrooms and abandoned churches, demanding worship and obedience. The machinery of terror had become inseparable from the machinery of adulation. Every title, every ritual, every purge was a step toward a country with no past, no future, and only one name worth remembering. In 1976, a new decree swept through Equatorial Guinea. It arrived not as a suggestion, but as a command from the president himself. The text was blunt. All surnames, especially those with Spanish or Christian roots, were abolished. From that moment, every citizen was required to adopt the name Nguema, the president's own family name. Civil registry offices received strict orders. Clerks were told to cross out old names in municipal books, to destroy or overwrite birth, marriage, and death certificates that carried any trace of a forbidden identity. Heads of households lined up at registry windows, holding documents that had defined their families for generations. One by one, those names were erased. The process was not left to chance. The JMM youth militia fanned out across towns and villages, moving door to door. They checked ration cards, school lists, and identity papers. Anyone who hesitated or tried to hide an old surname faced threats, beatings, or worse. In some districts, public meetings were called in the village square. Families were summoned, their names read aloud, then struck from the record. Children starting school were registered only as Nguema. Teachers received class lists with every student bearing the same surname, as if the country itself had become a single family, owned by one man. At the local level, administrators posted lists of approved names, always Nguema, on the walls of registry offices. Food rations and wages were withheld from those who failed to comply. Priests and church officials, guardians of baptismal records and family histories, were forced to surrender their books or face arrest. Some tried to hide the old registers, smuggling them to Spanish consulates or burning them in secret to prevent discovery. But most complied, fearing what might happen if they resisted. The pressure was absolute. The bureaucracy of erasure reached into every corner of daily life. Passports and identity cards were collected, altered, or destroyed. In some towns, entire pages of the civil register were rewritten in the same hand, line after line reading only Nguema. Survivors recall the humiliation of standing before police officers or party officials, watching their family names that had survived war, colonization, and exile, disappear with a single stroke of the pen. The decree's reach was total. Without the new name, citizens could not enroll in school, collect food, or receive medical care. Pregnant women, the elderly, even infants were stripped of their inherited identities. The message was absolute. There would be no history but the president's, no lineage but his own. The machinery of the state, once a tool for record-keeping, became an instrument of collective amnesia. In the space of a few months, the country's past was erased from the ledgers, replaced by a single word, Nguema, written over every life. In the years after the forced erasure of surnames, a new wave of terror swept across Equatorial Guinea, not through guns or prisons, but through the destruction of thought itself. The regime's agents began with the schools. Classrooms, once filled with children's voices, stood silent as teachers disappeared or fled. Blackboards were left blank, desks overturned, lesson plans abandoned. Libraries in cities and remote villages alike were shuttered or set ablaze. Shelves of textbooks, poetry, and history vanished overnight. Official orders declared education a foreign disease, and anyone caught with a book risked arrest, beating, or worse. The word intellectual became a curse whispered only in secret. It was never written down, but everyone understood the danger. To be called an intellectual was to invite suspicion, and to draw the gaze of the president's loyalists. Survivors recall neighbors burning their own books in backyards after dark, the smoke rising as a desperate act of self-preservation. Some teachers and priests tried to save fragments of knowledge, hiding battered volumes behind walls or beneath floorboards. A few managed to smuggle children's primers and family Bibles across the border into Cameroon and Spain, risking everything so memory might survive elsewhere. The regime's campaign reached into every corner of daily life. Party militants stormed homes, searching for forbidden papers, foreign magazines, or even handwritten notes. In Malabo and Bata, public bonfires consumed not just books but the records of entire generations, birth certificates, baptismal rolls, letters from abroad. With each burning, the machinery of the state tightened its grip. Official slogans replaced lessons. Children recited only the president's titles, their education reduced to praise and obedience. The few remaining schools became centers for indoctrination, stripped of any curriculum that might foster independent thought. Teachers who once taught mathematics or literature now drilled students in loyalty oaths, fearful that even a stray question could cost them their lives. Those who resisted did so in silence. Secret classes met at night, shifting from house to house, always wary of informers. Some children learned to read from scraps of a newspaper hidden in clothing. Others memorized stories passed down by elders. But the cost was high. Several teachers were arrested and executed after being caught with banned materials. Their names, like their books, disappeared from the record. By the end of the decade, the country's intellectual life had been gutted. The destruction was total. Over half of all schools closed, and nearly every library was emptied or destroyed. For a generation, the very act of thinking became an act of rebellion. The regime's war on words was a war on the mind itself, leaving a scar deeper than any wound. A silence where once there had been learning, laughter, and hope. Loyalty meant nothing in the final months of Macías Nguema's rule. Ministers, generals, even blood relatives found themselves accused of betrayal. No one was safe, not even those who had served him faithfully for years. The dictator's suspicion turned inward, and the circle around him grew smaller by the week. Family dinners became interrogations. Meetings ended with arrests. The air was thick with rumors of plots, most invented by the president himself. Dr. Julio Ondo Nkogo, the Minister of Health, and one of the last remaining professionals in government, believed his proximity to Macías offered some protection. He had treated the president through bouts of illness and paranoia, sometimes administering sedatives to calm his rages. But in the summer of 1979, that trust dissolved. Macías accused Dr. Ondo Nkogo of witchcraft and conspiracy, convinced that even his own physician was plotting against him. There was no trial, no evidence, only a whispered accusation and a midnight order. The doctor was arrested and executed, his body disposed of without ceremony. News of his death spread through the capital, sending a wave of terror through the remaining officials. If the president's own doctor could be killed, anyone could. Relatives of Macías fared no better. Cousins, nephews, and in-laws were summoned to the presidential compound, sometimes never returning. Survivors recall nights punctuated by gunshots and the sound of vehicles arriving at odd hours. Some were denounced for minor disagreements, others simply for being present when the president's mood turned. The regime's own police records, recovered after the coup, list dozens of family members executed between June and August 1979. Isolation became ritual. Macías abandoned the presidential palace, retreating to a hut deep in the forest. He trusted no one, holding meetings in darkness, surrounded by armed guards. Ministers waited for hours outside, never sure if they would be admitted or arrested. The machinery of government had collapsed into a theater of suspicion, where each day brought new disappearances. The terror was no longer abstract. It was personal, immediate, and inescapable. Night after night, deep in the rain-soaked forests outside Mongomo, government business became a theater of the absurd. Ministers and guards gathered at the edge of a clearing, waiting for hours, forbidden to speak above a whisper. The president had abandoned the palace, convinced that its walls were haunted by enemies and spirits. Instead, he ruled from a mud-walled hut, ringed with soldiers and flickering lanterns. The air inside was thick with the scent of burning herbs and sweat. Witch doctors, brought from distant villages, circled the president, chanting incantations and shaking gourds filled with bone and seed. They daubed his forehead with red ochre, pressed amulets into his hands, and muttered spells to shield him from invisible assassins. Some nights, Macías demanded animal sacrifices, goats or chickens. Their blood pooled on the dirt floor, offered to whatever force he believed could keep him alive. Survivors from his inner circle later described the president's eyes, wide and unblinking, as he listened to the witch doctor's warnings. He believed the spirits of the dead haunted every corner of the capital. He ordered his guards to dig up old graves, convinced that the bones of executed rivals still whispered secrets. No policy was made without ritual. Decisions about life and death, who would be arrested, who would be spared, were sealed by the crackle of fire, the muttered advice of spirit mediums, and the trembling hands of a man who no longer trusted the world outside the forest. During these sessions, Macías often chewed bitter roots, grinding iboga between his teeth. Guards reported that after hours of these rituals, the president's speech grew slurred and his thoughts tangled. He would pace the hut, muttering about plots and curses, then erupt into rages or collapse in exhausted silence. Eyewitnesses at his trial recalled how he sometimes ordered executions in the middle of the night, convinced that a shadow seen on the wall was proof of treason. ministers learned to nod and agree, terrified of contradicting his visions. The machinery of the state had become a fever dream. Official decrees were to be issued by candlelight, scrawled on scraps of paper after a witch doctor's blessing. The president's guards, themselves half mad with fear and exhaustion, enforced orders they barely understood. The line between policy and hallucination dissolved. In the forest hut, the president's rituals became the law of the land, and the terror that followed was as real as the blood on the floor. August 1979. The capital was quiet, but the silence was brittle. Inside the military barracks, Teodoro Obiang Nguema Mbasogo, Macías's nephew and army chief, met with a handful of trusted officers. Each man understood the risk. Failure meant execution, not just for themselves, but for their families. Supplies in the capital had run out. Soldiers loyal to Macías were exhausted, their pay weeks overdue, their trust eroded by months of arbitrary arrests and midnight executions. Fear and hunger had frayed loyalties until few believed anything would protect them. Rumors spread that the president was hoarding food and gold in the forest, guarded by witch doctors and a shrinking ring of armed men. Whispers told of talismans and secret rites, of a leader who had removed himself from ordinary reality. Obiang's plan relied on speed and secrecy. In the early hours of August 3rd, loyalists moved to seize the radio station and key roadblocks around Malibu. The Presidential Guard, cut off from reinforcements, surrendered after brief resistance. At the same time, commandos swept along the jungle roads leading to Mongomo, searching for Macías's hideout. They found the dictator crouched in a makeshift camp, surrounded by sacks of cash and a handful of followers. His eyes were wild, his words incoherent. He clutched a battered suitcase and a pistol, but offered no real fight. Days of flight and hiding had left him gaunt and delirious. Obiang's forces brought Macías back to the capital under heavy guard. Soldiers lined the streets, watching for any sign of loyalist uprising, but the city remained still. For the first time in over a decade, no one shouted the president's name. The coup was over in hours, but the sense of dread lingered. Survivors later described the moment not as liberation, but as the end of a nightmare lived in silence and fear. As news of the capture spread, families emerged from hiding. Some wept for lost relatives, others simply stared, uncertain what would follow. The machinery of terror had collapsed, but the scars it left behind would not fade quickly. The trial would come next. On that night, the spell of one man's absolute power was finally broken. The courtroom was silent as the charges were read. Francisco Macías Nguema, once the untouchable ruler of Equatorial Guinea, now faced a tribunal of military officers, survivors, and the very people whose lives he had shattered. Rows of witnesses waited to speak, holding statements that named the dead, the disappeared, and the erased. The indictment listed thousands of executions, forced exiles, and the systematic destruction of a nation's memory. Official estimates spoke of at least 20,000 killed, though the true number may never be known. Testimonies echoed through the chamber. A former teacher recounted the night her students vanished. A priest described burning baptismal records in fear. A mother spoke of the moment her family name was crossed out, her children registered as strangers. Each voice added to the weight of evidence, the forced renaming, the outlawing of dissent, the campaign against thought itself. Documents recovered from police archives were presented, lists of names, orders for arrest, decrees demanding loyalty or death. Survivor after survivor stood to confirm what the regime had tried to erase. Macías listened, unmoved. When called to speak, he dismissed the accusations as the lies of traitors and foreigners. He denied every crime. He declared he was the miracle by which this nation exists. He said he had never erred. He claimed to be the father of all, the unique. He insisted God spoke through him. His words, once repeated in every classroom and public square, now hung in the air like a curse. Even confronted with overwhelming proof, he clung to the belief that only his will mattered, that the suffering around him was an illusion or a plot. The tribunal delivered its sentence: death by firing squad. On September 29, 1979, Macías was led before the assembled panel. Survivors watched as the man who had outlawed their names and erased their histories met the fate he had so often ordered for others. He died without confession, still insisting on his own perfection, untouched by doubt or remorse. In the end, the only truth he recognized was the one he had invented for himself. Today, governments worldwide still attempt to rewrite histories, silence dissent, and erase identities in pursuit of absolute control. Macías Nguema's reign, where a single mind's fear stripped millions of their names, reminds us that unchecked power can weaponize paranoia. The urge to erase identity is never just history. It is a warning. Every time we let fear dictate reality, we risk repeating the darkest chapters. What would you defend if your name was at stake?